And now I'd like to introduce Mark Watts. Mark has served as Executive Director of C40 Cities since December 2013, during which time the organisation has grown from 63 to 96 of the world's greatest cities. From inception, C40's mission has been to be a high ambition leadership group, driving the world to avoid a climate crisis through the action and leadership of the mayors of the world's leading cities. In 2016, C40 became the first major organisation to insist that a 1.5 degree target was essential rather than aspirational. Prior to joining C40 Cities, Mark was a director at the engineering and design firm Arup, and before that was a senior advisor to the Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone. He reports to C40 Chairperson and Mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, and C40 Board President, Mayor Michael R. Bloomberg. Because of the time difference between here and the UK, we pre-recorded this presentation from Mark a little earlier. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, David, and it's great to be part of this event today, albeit virtually and from a long way away. So as David's just mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of C40. It's a leadership group on climate breakdown, led by mayors of major cities all around the world, focused on collectively halving their emissions by 2030 to really push forward that Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. For this year, 2020, the mayors in C40, as in so many other cities around the world, have really been on the front line of fighting the COVID-19 health crisis, right from Wuhan, one of our members, where the pandemic started, through then the epicenter moving to Europe and Milan and Paris, New York, the United States, where very much the virus still has hold, and the current epicenter in South America, particularly in Brazil, our cities in Sao Paulo and Rio. And it's something that therefore we as an organisation have had to very much turn around, because it's affecting everything that our mayors do. But very typically, mayors have wanted to work together both to tackle the COVID crisis and to think about the recovery. Next slide, please. And I think that is one of the real positives of working with mayors and with city governments generally, but particularly in the last 6 months, is this pandemic has really underlined the ability and the desire of mayors to collaborate globally to solve global problems and improve all of their cities. And it's a real testament to the survival of multilateralism, which is under threat from failings in the intergovernmental arena. What you see on the screen here is one of the very regular meetings of C40 mayors across the world throughout the COVID crisis, both helping each other think how to manage the initial health crisis, but then to plan for a green and just recovery. Next slide, please. And indeed, that's where we're at the moment. So we still have lots of cities in C40 that are very much in the midst of a health crisis, others that are starting to emerge, particularly in Asia and the Oceania area, as you know well, but all thinking about what building back better really means. And so one of the things that we've done at the instigation of the Mayor of Milan, Beppe Sala, was to create a green and just recovery task force in C40 with mayors from every one of our regions. It recently launched a playbook, which is advocating for a green and just recovery, showing what mayors are already doing, but also making demands, requests, proposals to national governments for what they need to do to ensure that that recovery really is green and just. And it's based on the understanding that the roots of this coronavirus pandemic are an environmental destruction, destroying habitats, bringing wildlife closer to human civilization than they should be. But also that whilst this pandemic is all consuming at the moment, the climate crisis is ultimately a much bigger one, a much greater threat for human survival and our civilization, and we can't take our eyes off that crisis even while we're dealing with the pandemic. Also, as you see in the title, Green and Just, because we very much recognise in C40 that the problems of growing inequality are completely intertwined with that of dealing with the climate crisis, and that the COVID crisis has thrown up just how deep those inequalities are across many parts of the world, and as with everything, it's the poorest in society that suffer most whenever society is under great stress. Next slide, please. So one of the things we've been doing as part of this task force is taking evidence from internationally leading economists to help mayors think about practically the steps they need to take now to ensure that the recovery is green and is just, but also what is the kind of economy, what's the kind of society that they want to be working towards, what's the goal, recognising that there's very significant changes happening in society as a result of the pandemic, but also needed to solve the climate crisis. And so one of the people we took evidence for is Kate Rayworth, the author of Donut Economics. And she really had quite a profound effect on C40 mayors, thinking, not least working directly with some. You see the image here of the work she's done with Amsterdam, but more broadly, the proposition that mayors have got to be interventionist if they're to deliver a green and just recovery. To create thriving cities needs proactive policy. There's a real big, important role for governments at all levels. You can't just assume that as long as we have economic growth, that all problems will be solved. Indeed, the evidence of the last few decades is the contrary, that we've had ever rising economic growth whilst ever increasing environmental problems that ultimately will massively hold back that further economic performance. Secondly, that therefore you really need to put public services at the heart of the recovery, just as public services have been very much at the heart of managing the pandemic across the world. And we've seen in all jurisdictions a surge in public support for public institutions, often for government at the local level, even if they're not satisfied with the performance at the federal level, and a recognition of the importance of community and collaboration in creating better societies. And then the third point that really connects those two is that we need entrepreneurial mayors that will intervene to create and shape markets. If we're going to overcome the climate crisis, bring emissions down rapidly, adapt to the climate breakdown that's already happening, as well as getting out of this immediate health crisis and helping people get back to work. And really that flies in the face of predominant economic thinking of the 20th century. But now it's very clear that the risks of public inaction far outweigh the risks of action. And so a kind of new 21st century economics that's fit for the challenges that we face. And if we move on to the next slide, please, just to give some examples of what that means in practice. So as some of our cities are starting to move into a recovery phase from COVID, we're seeing first and foremost a push to invest in good new green jobs. So using public funding, public utilities to ensure that the jobs that replace those lost in the pandemic are going to be predominantly, if not exclusively, green ones, and good jobs that provide good standards of living, good wages, that help build the kind of sharing collaborative society that we want to see in the future. A few examples of that in Seoul. There, the city is creating 20,000, huge number of new green jobs through an absolutely massive program of retrofitting all of their municipal buildings, doing that in the space of 2 to 3 years, much, much quicker than they'd previously been planning, as well as ratcheting up their mandatory zero energy building standards for new buildings, again, many years ahead of the schedule that they'd previously seen. So rather than holding back on climate action, seeing this as a way to spur economic development and spur recovery. Similarly, but slightly differently, in Los Angeles, you see there the image on the screen of the vast areas of the Mojave Desert that's covered now in solar panels and wind turbines, invested by the publicly owned utility in Los Angeles. But they're also working with the private sector using solar power purchase agreements that will help the city reach a 55% renewable energy target by 2025, way ahead of the rest of the United States. But as part of that agreement, insisting on good paying unionized jobs so that we're building a strong society with good employment into that new green energy framework. And in Rotterdam, in Europe, where I'm from, where the port is really the center of the economy, the mayor is investing, supporting the port so that it can become a carbon neutral hydrogen economy hub, one of the ways out of highly polluting shipping industry, but at the same time investing in the circular economy in the city so that they become, Amsterdam and Rotterdam together become centers of reusing, of recycling, of redeveloping products and massively reducing, halving in fact, the use of fossil fuel materials within the next decade. The second part of the this playbook, C40 playbook on COVID, green and just recovery, is focused on improving resilience to climate breakdown and improving equity together. And that's got a twin focus on ensuring the continuation and improvement of the fundamental public services that underpin a fair society, whilst also investing to protect particularly the most vulnerable from the ever-increasing impacts of climate change. And right at the top of that list has been a focus around mass transit, public transport, because we see everywhere in the world that is completely essential to having sustainable cities, but is massively undermined by COVID lockdowns in many places where ridership is as much as 90% down in my city of London, and revenues have collapsed as a result. And the vast majority of mass transit systems require huge public subsidy all over the world because they're a public good. So trying to think how to protect them. And if we move on to the next slide, please. Some examples of that closer to home in Australia and Auckland in New Zealand, obviously one of the countries that's coped best with the COVID crisis. But even there, a need to demonstrate to the public that it's safe to use public transport whilst COVID is around. And Auckland developed a mobile app that gives passengers real-time bus capacity so they can choose whether or not to board a bus to see that it's safe, which is now being adopted, copied in many cities across C40, along with a big new investment, 1.4 billion New Zealand dollars, to support dedicated congestion-free busways between major town centres. And this is in a city that doesn't have a very extensive mass transit system at the moment, but is pivoting off the COVID crisis to expand those services rather to contract them, and with a big boost to jobs and incomes as a result. A somewhat different example in Lisbon, in Portugal, again, one of the countries in Europe that's coped best with COVID, a very progressive mayor there that has seen a huge change in their economy in the pandemic, very reliant on tourism, thousands of properties that would normally be let out to tourists unoccupied. And so the mayor has taken the decision to work with the private sector to convert those formerly tourist properties into affordable housing units, and really changing the dynamic of the city centre so that the city centre retains some of its vibrancy that's lost from the lack of tourists, and rebuilding the community there that had become quite strong through collaboration during lockdown. And at the same time, looking at ensuring long-term stable incomes for landlords, but whilst having rent controls to ensure that key workers, many of whom will be housed in these newly available units, can have affordable rent. So it's a real public-private partnership. Next slide, please. And the third and final section then of this green and just recovery playbook is looking at the broader issues of health and well-being in the context of COVID, but also of climate breakdown. And two sort of major themes, and then kind of one thing, the 15-minute city, that brings them all together. The first is really giving streets back to people, and the absence of cars during lockdown has really, all around the world, shown people how much nicer our cities are when the air is blue, the sky is blue, the air is clean, there's less noise from cars, and we've seen massive increases in cycling. Indeed, I was talking with colleagues in the city of Sydney last week, and they were talking about the fact that they've been able to invest in new segregated cycle lanes that were planned to be developed over 5 years, but instead have been delivered in 10 weeks. And that's something we've seen in Bogota, in Milan, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, all over the world, taking out parking spaces, giving more space to pedestrians. So a new city that will result, a new mobility that will result from that, with huge benefits to people's health, because of course, more people die in every average year for the last decade from air pollution than have so far been killed by the horrors of the COVID pandemic. And we must remember that that's the big killer that's always lurking there. And now COVID's given a chance to accelerate efforts to improve our air quality. And secondly, very much related to that, a big focus on nature. People all around the world have seen the benefits of public spaces, of parks, of green spaces, whilst in lockdown. In Montreal, the mayor has cancelled a major new development that was going to be on greenfield land, which will now instead be a massive new public park. Or looking in Quezon City in Manila, in the Philippines, where one of the problems that the city confronted during the COVID crisis was an inability to bring food reliably into the city. And so the mayor there now is dedicating huge parts of the city to urban agricultural production, which will also have great benefits in defending from rising flooding. But if we can move on to the next slide, please, and I'm coming to the end here. That real focus on holding on to our blue skies and clean air while reopening our economy has seen a massive step forward in Paris. The radical mayor, Anne Hidalgo, formerly the chair of C40, has won re-election in Paris partly on the basis of a concept of a 15-minute city, that everybody in that huge metropolis of Paris should be able to live within 15 minutes of all the basic services that they need to have a good life. And that means education services, health services, work, so not necessarily needing to commute into the centre of the city every day, along with access to green space. And it's meaning a really radical change to planning in Paris, huge shifts in public space, taking out major roads in the city and giving them back to pedestrians and cyclists and green space. And the most important thing here, because it's extremely radical, it's popular. Mayor Hidalgo's opponents ran on a platform opposing that 15-minute city concept, and she won very decisively. So a big positive message to mayors around the world. And next slide, please, which I think is coming towards the close. I have to, of course, mention here the wonderful cities of Sydney and Melbourne that are such a big part of C40. As I've said already, I've been very inspired by what Sydney is doing around cycling, that aggressive acceleration of segregated cycle lane building, but also the focus on specifically trying to encourage more women to cycle in Sydney, and the research that they've been doing around that, which really sort of suggests that some different approaches needed. Lots of women who cycle but don't see themselves as cyclists. And in Melbourne, again, a big focus on cycling, but also a massive new tree planting, shrub planting program that really speaks to that kind of greening of the city that I've been talking about. And here, a 20-minute city concept, which I think fits for Melbourne, which is much more of a car-based city to begin with compared to Paris, denser and more public transport. Final slide, please. So all of what I've talked about so far is the bulk of C40's approach to building back better, green and just, and what mayors can do, but there is also, of course, an ask for national governments. And the two most important in these 6 things here are the ones that are in green, that C40 mayors have come together to say to their national government, to say to the international community, that all stimulus coming out of COVID should be green, not some of it, all of it, and that we need an end to all public fossil fuel investments and subsidies, because we have to end the fossil fuel economy and move decisively to a green and just economy. Thanks very much for the opportunity to participate today, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the other contributions.
Well, thanks, Mark. Some really fantastic and inspirational examples there from some wonderful cities around the world, including, of course, Sydney and Melbourne. But yeah, great to see what is happening in the international scene. We've got a little bit of time left. I'd just like to ask you a couple of quick questions, if I could. Many councils around the world, cities around the world, are taking big hits to their revenue because of COVID-19. And of course, we're looking for stimulus to be provided by governments at regional, state, national levels. Are you seeing examples of that stimulus coming through that are actually directed to supporting a green recovery? I know you're calling for that. Are you seeing that coming through at this point?
Not nearly enough yet. So, I mean, the bold figures that Bloomberg New Energy Finance has analysed is that of the 700 odd billion of stimulus that's so far been put forward, only about 54 billion is green in any way. Actually, a big chunk of it is absolutely directly supporting fossil fuel industries or those that are heavily polluting. We've seen some examples of governments that have supported mayors. In the UK, for example, the government has subsidised transport for London, but it's not nearly enough, and it's come with big strings attached. Some examples, positive examples in Korea and China, where there you can see the direction of travel is very much a green stimulus, but no, the short answer is no, and we need to see a lot more support for city governments that are really suffering with their finances.
Yeah, thank you. And just a final question. Obviously, you brought together a wonderful group of mayors to work on this. And we saw a slide of that Zoom meeting in there. Do you have any reflections on how mayors have been collaborating through the C40 COVID task force that might be useful for mayors here in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, it's been so inspiring. I particularly when you see in the intergovernmental arena, this has been, a desperate time for multilateralism, with the US pulling out of the World Health Organization. Generally speaking, national governments have, however well they've done individually, have retreated inwards and focused on their own individual ways of managing COVID. The complete opposite has happened with cities. Immediately the crisis started happening, I was getting calls from mayors. We want to talk to each other, set up a platform. We want to share, we want to learn. And it's been extremely direct, both boosting each other's confidence about carrying on focus on the green and just whilst in the pandemic, directly sharing and copying ideas. We've had mayors that came together to create new standards for managing waste under COVID because none existed internationally, right down to direct support. We've had Chinese cities have been sending huge amounts of PPE to other C40 cities around the world because they came out of their lockdown earlier. I think the main message for Australia and everywhere else is keep talking to each other. It's always beneficial. You always learn and you always can go faster together than working separately.
Wonderful. Well, Mark, I'd really like to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today, all the way from England. Thank you so much.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thanks again to Mark Watts for those great examples of how mayors and cities around the world are tackling the economic recovery. We will now take a short break and resume the program at 11:30. Go and make a cup of tea and we'll see you soon. Thank you.